The ship rose from the dry dock like a living creature of metal and ambition. Steam hissed from the welders' torches as the Shokaku, the Soaring Crane, took her final shape beneath the grey winter sky of Yokosuka. For the engineers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, she represented the summit of their art, a carrier forged from steel and national pride, a synthesis of speed, strength, and deadly elegance. At 25,675 tons, Shōkaku was one of the most advanced warships afloat. Her hull lines were long and clean, designed to cut through the Pacific with the grace of her namesake bird. Beneath her flight deck, 6 boilers powered 4 Campon turbines, producing 160,000 horsepower, enough to drive her to 34 knots, faster than many destroyers. Her armoured hangars and reinforced deck could withstand punishment that would cripple other carriers. She carried 72 aircraft, Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, the wings of Japan's coming empire. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, visited the dock during her fitting out. He stood silently for a long time, his gloved hands behind his back, studying her lines. "This ship," he said finally, "is our future." To him and the officers of the Kaigun, the Shokaku and her sister ship Zuikaku symbolized the rebirth of Japan's naval might, a match for anything Britain or America could launch. The name Shōkaku was chosen carefully. In Japanese lore, the crane is a creature of longevity and grace, a symbol of endurance. "The crane never dies," the proverb said. It was an omen the Navy believed in with almost religious faith. Her crest, a golden crane in flight, was painted on her island structure, and sailors whispered that she would soar above the enemy and never fall. In October 1941, she joined the 1st Air Fleet, the newly formed Kido Butai, the world's first true carrier strike force. Alongside Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Zuikaku, and herself, the Shokaku completed the 6-winged spearhead of Japan's naval air power. Their combined air groups could project more striking force than any surface fleet in history. 2 months later, she sailed into legend. On December 7, 1941, Shokaku's aircraft lifted off her deck in the grey dawn south of Oahu. Commander Takahashi's Val bombers and Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya's Zeros were among the first to hit Pearl Harbor. The battleships Arizona and Oklahoma burned. America woke to a new kind of war. From her bridge, Captain Takatsugu Jojima watched the returning planes circle back with their victory signals. No major damage, minimal losses. Shōkaku's decks were stained with salt and oil, but her crew cheered. She had struck the first blow. Her war had begun in triumph. It would not end that way. In the months that followed, Shōkaku ranged across the Pacific, Rabaul, Leh, Ceylon, Coral Sea. At Coral Sea in May 1942, her luck faltered. American SBD Dauntless bombers from Yorktown and Lexington found her. 2 1,000-pound bombs ripped through her flight deck and hangars, igniting avgas and aircraft. 43 men died in the fires. Her decks were scarred and buckled. Yet her crew's discipline saved her. Counter-flooding corrected the list, pumps kept her alive, and under smoke cover she escaped southward to Truk. Repairs took 3 months in Yokosuka. Workers marvelled at the scars that had failed to kill her. "The crane returns," they said. Her sister Zuikaku, which had escaped unscathed, awaited her. When both sailed again in October, the pair were reborn, the Crane sisters of the Imperial Navy. Their next great test came at Santa Cruz, October 1942. By then, the tide had begun to shift. American radar and new carrier tactics had turned the seas around Guadalcanal into a slaughterhouse for pilots. Yet Shōkaku's air group, hardened veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, fought with deadly skill. Lieutenant Commander Junichi Sasai led the Zeros, weaving through anti-aircraft fire to hammer the Enterprise and Hornet. They succeeded in crippling Hornet, but victory came at a terrible cost. Nearly half of Shokaku's aviators never returned. That battle marked the beginning of Japan's slow unravelling. The carrier survived, but the men who made her formidable were dying faster than they could be replaced. Each loss of an ace was a wound that no amount of steel could repair. In early 1943, the Shōkaku returned to Truk Lagoon, her decks quieter now. Her flight crews were younger, less trained, her once proud squadrons filled with replacements. The veterans called them the children. They tried to teach them the old ways, the discipline of the Kido Butai, the precision of massed attacks, but fuel shortages and lack of training hours doomed them before they ever saw the enemy. By 1944, Japan's war machine was running on fumes, literally. Crude oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies were strangled by US submarines. Shōkaku, despite her engine's power, could barely sail at full speed without rationing every drop of fuel. Aircraft production lagged, pilots were undertrained, and the once proud combined fleet had become a shadow of its former self. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, now commander of the carrier force, visited her at Singapore that spring. He walked her decks in silence, past the polished brass and weary faces. The ship was immaculate, as if by keeping her clean, the crew could deny the decay of the empire she served. Ozawa addressed them simply. "You are the last of the Kido Butai. The spirit of Japan sails with you. We have lost much, but not honor." Below deck, engineers patched aging turbines with parts scavenged from other ships. The pilots still saluted smartly, but many had never seen combat. The officers knew it, the men sensed it. The Soaring Crane still looked magnificent, but her wings were growing thin. Across the Pacific, America was awakening into industrial fury. Dozens of new Essex-class carriers and hundreds of destroyers filled the seas once ruled by Japan. In April, B-29 bombers began striking the home islands. For the first time, the Shokaku's crew realized that the enemy they had once humiliated had become an unstoppable tide. Still, she sailed. Orders came from Tokyo. Operation Ago, the decisive counterattack to destroy the American invasion of the Marianas. To the Japanese Admiralty, the battle to come would be the redemption of their fleet, the chance to prove that the spirit of Yamamoto still guided them. In her wardroom, Captain Hiroshi Matsubara, her final commanding officer, briefed his lieutenants before sailing from Tawi-Tawi in June 1944. He spoke calmly, though the exhaustion in his voice was clear. "We have been called the crane that never dies. Let us see if the gods still believe it." Above him, on her island bridge, the rising sun flag rippled in the equatorial wind. Beneath that banner, the last of Japan's great carriers steamed toward destiny. No one aboard could know that within weeks the Shokaku's name would become a whisper among survivors and a shockwave through the halls of the Admiralty in Tokyo. The ship that had launched Japan's war would not live to see its end. The Soaring Crane still flew proud, her decks gleaming, her crew disciplined. But the air she sailed through, the Empire's air, was already burning away. Pearl Harbor Submarine Base, 1943 to 1944. The Pacific smelled of oil and salt, of metal and death. By 1943, it was no longer Japan's ocean. Beneath its rolling blue surface, invisible hunters moved silently, waiting for the next convoy, the next carrier, the next chance to change the course of the war. One of those hunters was a new submarine, sleek, steel grey and freshly painted with her commissioning number, SS-244. Her name was USS Cavalla. She was a Ballot-class submarine, 311 feet long, 27 feet wide, and capable of diving to 400 feet. Built at Groton, Connecticut, and commissioned in February 1944, she embodied everything the U.S. Navy had learned through 2 years of brutal, costly experience. Her engines purred quietly, Her sonar and radar were cutting edge, and her torpedo tubes had been recalibrated for reliability after a year of shameful mechanical failures. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, was 34 years old, tall and meticulous. A graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1934, he had served on older S-boats during the early war years. He knew what it meant to fire perfect shots, only to watch torpedoes misfire or run too deep. "The sea doesn't forgive," he told his men during their first dive drill out of Pearl. "It doesn't give second chances either, so we'll make the first one count." Pearl Harbor's submarine base had changed since 1942. Where once oil fires and wrecked battleships had smouldered, new docks now thrummed with industry. Submarines slipped in and out daily, their decks crowded with men who looked more like mechanics than sailors, grease-stained, lean and sunburned. Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Fleet Submarine Force, was turning these men into the most efficient killers on the ocean. His strategy was simple: strangle Japan. Every tanker, freighter and transport destroyed was a wound to the Empire's war machine. Lockwood's orders to his captains were blunt: sink ships, sink them fast, sink them smart, and for God's sake come back alive. By mid-1944, the results were devastating. American submarines, just 2% of the Navy's personnel, had already sunk over half of Japan's merchant fleet and more than one-third of its warships. The once proud imperial convoys now sailed in fear, weaving across the sea like hunted animals. USS Cavalla joined this silent armada in the spring of 1944. Her crew of 82 trained relentlessly in Hawaiian waters. Kostler drilled them on silent running, emergency dives, and attack simulations. The men learned to read sonar echoes like language, to listen for the beat of distant propellers, and to live for weeks in steel tubes without sunlight or privacy. Life aboard a submarine was claustrophobic and constant. The air reeked of diesel, sweat, and machine oil. Bunks were stacked 3 high, and every space had to serve 2 purposes: storage by day, sleep by night. The only luxury was coffee, always hot and bitter. Yet for these men, the submarine was more than a vessel. It was home, weapon, and world. Their training culminated with torpedo firing exercises. The new Mark 18 electric torpedo, developed after years of frustration with the defective Mark 14, left no telltale bubble trail. "Invisible death," the men called it. Kostler's executive officer, Lieutenant Bill Driscoll, kept a small notebook filled with firing angles and calculations, muttering them like prayers. Before their first war patrol, Kostler gathered the crew in the control room. The red battle lights glowed against their faces. "Men, this boat was built for one thing: to find and kill the enemy. You'll be scared and you'll be tired. But remember this: every ship we sink shortens the war. Every ton of steel that goes to the bottom brings our boys closer to home." Their orders came from Admiral Lockwood himself. Cavalla's mission: proceed west through Midway, patrol north of the Philippines, and intercept Japanese fleet movements between Tawi-Tawi and the Marianas. The timing was critical. American intelligence, based on intercepted Japanese radio traffic, indicated that the Imperial Navy was preparing a major operation to defend the Marianas, an operation that would soon be known as AGO. By June 1944, Cavalla was deep in enemy waters. The Pacific above her was vast and silent, but her sonar operators could hear the pulse of war. Merchant ships, patrol vessels, and distant carriers all produced distinct sound patterns, some fast and rhythmic, others slow and heavy. The men learned to recognize each one like a hunter knowing his prey's footsteps. The Japanese, meanwhile, were losing their grasp on the sea. Submarine warfare had never been a priority for them. Their convoys often sailed without sonar-equipped escorts, and their depth charge patterns were erratic and ineffective. While the Imperial Navy had built its doctrine around the glory of carrier air power, the Americans had turned to something colder and more mathematical: attrition through invisibility. Kosler respected the enemy, but he knew Japan's weakness lay in its pride. "They believe war belongs to the surface," he wrote in his patrol log. "They haven't yet understood that it belongs to the deep." The submarine crews lived in silence and tension. Days passed with nothing but the hum of the engines and the whisper of propellers. Then, suddenly, the alarm would sound, "Contact bearing 210, range 10,000 yards," and every man sprang to his station. There was no fanfare in submarine combat, no grand fleets or banners, just seconds of perfect coordination followed by minutes of chaos. A single mistake, a noisy valve, a misread echo, could mean death by depth charge. When news reached them via coded dispatch that U.S. forces had invaded Saipan, Kosler knew what would come next. The Japanese Navy would have to respond. Operation Eigo was unfolding, and carriers, Japan's last hope, would be moving north through the Philippine Sea. Lockwood's headquarters sent one final encrypted order. Subforce Pacific, all units, expect carrier movement, shadow and report, attack if opportunity presents. For Kosler, it was the moment he had trained for. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the pride of Japan, the Shokaku, the Zuikaku and the Taiho, were steaming toward destiny. He looked through the periscope at the vast blue emptiness and said quietly, "They think we're ghosts down here. Let's show them ghosts can kill." When Cavalla submerged again, the ocean closed over her like a curtain. The crew settled into their stations, listening for the faint heartbeat of propellers. The hunt for the Shokaku had begun. Southwest Pacific, June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea. At dawn, the ocean lay deceptively still, a perfect mirror for the rising sun. Beneath that glassy calm, 60 feet under the surface, the USS Cavalla SS-244 sliced through the dark blue world at 5 knots. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kosler, a tall, calm man with a thin face and an instinct for patience, was stalking prey he could not yet see but could almost feel. For days, Cavalla had been part of a reconnaissance line deployed ahead of Task Force 58, the fast carriers of Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, as they steamed toward the Marianas. The Americans were luring out the Japanese combined fleet, hoping to crush it in open sea. To Kosler, it was a hunter's dream, an ocean vast, the air thick with rumour and radio whispers of something immense moving east. Ozawa's mobile fleet, the last great carrier force Japan could muster. The Cavalla's crew, 80 men packed in steel and sweat, lived by whispers. Sound was everything. The hum of the motors, the distant pings of sonar, the faint crackle of the TDC, torpedo data computer. In the control room, red lights glowed like blood vessels, and the air smelled of oil and battery acid. At 0830, a sonar operator leaned forward, his headphones pressed tight. "Contact bearing 210. Distant, multiple screws, sir." Kosler's eyes flicked up. "Mark bearing. Plot course. Let's come right. Slowly." The plot began to thicken. Over the next 30 minutes, sonar reported several contacts, large, fast, steady courses. Warships, not destroyers, too deep in their sound profile. This was something larger, a carrier group. Kosler's hand tightened around his coffee mug. He set it down without a sound. "All right, gentlemen. We've just earned our breakfast." The Cavalla moved cautiously, her periscope barely breaking the surface. Through the narrow lens, Kosler's first view was a sight both terrible and magnificent. On the horizon, rising from the haze, the unmistakable outline of a fleet carrier, broad flight deck, rising island, and the faint dotting of aircraft on deck. It was the Shōkaku. She was flanked by destroyers, the Urikaze, Isokaze, and Tanikaze, weaving and slicing through the water in protective arcs. Ahead of her steamed cruisers, Maya and Chokai. The Japanese were steaming northeast at 19 knots, heading toward the battle area now forming around the Philippine Sea. Kosler's heart thumped once, hard, and then steadied. This was the prize of a lifetime. A carrier that had survived Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and 2 years of relentless war. A ghost ship of Japan's once invincible fleet. And now, fate had placed her in his periscope's crosshairs. He called quietly into the con. "Battle stations! Torpedo!" The ship came alive in disciplined silence. Crewmen moved through narrow passageways, closing hatches, checking gyros, arming the Mark 23 torpedoes in tubes 1 through 6. Kosler studied the plot. Course 090, target moving left to right, range about 1,200 yards, closing. The Shōkaku's escorts, though vigilant, had strayed a little ahead, leaving a window, barely a few minutes long, where the Cavalla could strike undetected. "Set depth to 10 feet below keel," Kosler ordered. "Fire on the second bearing mark." Through the periscope, the Shōkaku loomed larger now, the crane insignia faintly visible near her stern, sunlight gleaming off her flight deck. Aircraft were spotted aft, perhaps preparing for launch. To the Americans, she was just another steel target, but to the Japanese, she was a living shrine. Kosler whispered, "Steady, steady." "Fire 1!" The torpedo hissed from its tube, a muffled roar echoing through the hull. "Fire 2! Fire 3! Fire 4!" Each shot spaced 7 seconds apart. Cavalla turned sharply down and away, diving to 400 feet. "Rig for depth charge," Kosler said quietly. The crew held their breath. Minutes passed, long, torturous minutes. Then, through the water, a low, rising boom rolled across the hull. Then another, then 2 more in quick succession. "4 hits!" shouted the soundman. "4 solid explosions!" Kosler's hands clenched the chart table. He said nothing. Above them, through thousands of tons of seawater, the Shōkaku was dying. On the carrier, chaos reigned. The first torpedo struck near the forward aviation fuel tanks, igniting fumes and sending a plume of fire through the lower hangar. The second hit amidships, crippling the power grid. The third and fourth exploded near the aft elevator and port engine room, flooding compartments instantly. Captain Hiroshi Matsubara tried desperately to counter-flood and keep the ship steady. Fire mains were ruptured, pumps failed. Within minutes, aviation gasoline from ruptured lines ignited the hangar deck, where armed and fueled A6M0s and D3A valves were being readied. The explosion tore through the ship like a thunderclap. Survivors later described seeing the flight deck buckle upward. Planes and crew were thrown into the sea. Smoke towered into the sky, a black column marking the death of a legend. In the Cavalla's control room, the sound of distant secondary explosions echoed through the sonar headphones. "Multiple detonations, sir. She's going up." Kosler exhaled for the first time in minutes. "That'll be all, men. Let's get deep and stay quiet." For the next 2 hours, the Cavalla was hunted mercilessly. Japanese destroyers rained more than 100 depth charges, shaking the submarine like a tin can. Bulkheads creaked. A gasket burst in the aft battery compartment. But the Cavalla held, slipping into a thermocline layer, her hull absorbing the pressure, her crew silent as death. At last, the sounds above faded. The destroyers rejoined the fleet. The sonar quieted. Cavalla surfaced cautiously after nightfall. The ocean was empty, save for patches of oil and burning debris. In the distance, faint flames licked the horizon where the Shōkaku had gone down. At 14:30 hours, June 19th, 1944, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the Shōkaku, survivor of every major battle since Pearl Harbor, slid beneath the waves with over 1,200 men still aboard. Only a few hundred were rescued by nearby destroyers. Kosler radioed in the contact report in tight cryptic code. Attacked large carrier, probable Shokaku, 4 hits, heavy secondary explosions, vessel sunk. Admiral Lockwood at Pearl Harbor received the message and smiled grimly. "Gentlemen," he said to his staff, "that's for Pearl Harbor." In Japan, news of the sinking reached the combined fleet days later. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, now leading the decimated mobile fleet, received the telegram in his flag cabin aboard Taiho. He read it twice in silence, then laid it on the table. "The Crane," he said quietly, "has fallen." The officers around him did not speak. For them it was not merely the loss of a ship, it was the death of an era, the last gleam of the fleet Yamamoto had built, the last living link to the victories of 1941. And in the dark sea between the Marianas and the Philippines, the Shōkaku's wreck lay silent, her flight deck twisted, her planes entombed, her crane emblem glimmering faintly in the cold deep. The hunter below had struck, and the empire above would never rise again. June 19th to 20th, 1944, Philippine Sea. When the sun rose on June 20th, 1944, the Philippine Sea was a graveyard of ambitions. Oil slicks stretched across the blue, flames smouldered where once had sailed the pride of the Imperial Navy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was nearly over. But for the men who fought it, the day still carried the stench of burning aviation fuel and the echoes of shattered hope. From his bridge aboard the carrier Taiho, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stared out at the horizon where the Shokaku had vanished hours earlier. Reports confirmed her loss. The Soaring Crane, symbol of resilience and grace, was gone, taking with her over 1,200 officers and men. Ozawa stood silently, his hands clasped behind his back. The wind carried the acrid smoke of nearby wreckage. For a long while he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he murmured, "One by one the feathers fall." No one replied. His staff understood. The Shokaku's death was only the beginning. The mobile fleet, Japan's last carrier force, had steamed east from Tawi-Tawi just a week earlier, with the intention of turning the tide in the Marianas. It was supposed to be a decisive blow, a second Midway, but this time on Japanese terms. In reality, it was a march toward annihilation. Fuel shortages had crippled training. Pilots, many barely out of flight school, had logged less than 100 hours of carrier time. The fleet's air groups, once elite, were now filled with untested youths, while maintenance crews struggled with inferior aircraft and dwindling resources. Intelligence failures and overconfidence led Tokyo to believe the Americans were weaker than they were. By contrast, Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded an armada of overwhelming power. 15 carriers, 956 aircraft, radar-equipped and battle-hardened. Their pilots were veterans of the Gilberts, Marshalls and Truk, men who had fought and survived Japan's best. When Ozawa's force launched its first airstrike on June 19th, it was met with slaughter. In the skies above the Philippine Sea, the battle unfolded with mechanical precision and human tragedy. American Hellcats from the USS Lexington, Yorktown and Bunker Hill dove into the waves of Japanese planes, guided by radar controllers who could see hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. One Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, later described the sight. "They came in like locusts, one wave after another. But they flew in straight lines, no cover, no coordination. We tore them apart." In less than 8 hours, US pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft, for the loss of fewer than 30 of their own. So many Japanese pilots perished that American flyers began calling it the greatest turkey shoot in history. For the Japanese, it was more than a defeat. It was the death of their carrier air arm. At 1400 hours, aboard the Taiho, a single US submarine changed history again. The USS Albacore SS-218, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James W. Blanchard, had stalked Ozawa's flagship for hours. When a torpedo streaked toward Taiho, a Japanese pilot on deck saw it and dove his Zero into the sea to detonate it early. A suicidal act that saved the ship for a moment. But another torpedo struck home, ripping into her starboard side near the aviation fuel tanks. At first, the damage seemed contained. Pumps worked, fires were small. Ozawa, confident, remained aboard, directing the fleet. But as the hours passed, gasoline fumes built up in the lower decks. Poor ventilation, and the fatal decision to run the ship's ventilation fans, spread the vapour throughout the hangars. At 15:30, the inevitable happened. A single spark, from a shorted motor perhaps, ignited the fumes. The Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, erupted in a massive internal explosion. Steel plates buckled, the flight deck split open. Ozawa was blown into the sea, where he was rescued hours later by the destroyer Wakatsuki. Over 1,600 men died. In one day, the Imperial Navy had lost both its oldest surviving fleet carrier and its newest. That night, in Tokyo, the Navy Ministry received the first fragmentary reports. Shokaku sunk, Taiho heavily damaged, communications with Ozawa intermittent. In the war room at the Imperial Palace, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo frowned at the telegram. He turned to Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, the Navy Minister, and asked quietly, "What remains of our air power?" Shimada hesitated. "The Zuikaku still fights," he said, "and we will rebuild." But both men knew the truth. Japan's carrier fleet, the sword that had carved its empire, was now a shadow. For the Americans, the battle ended with Mitcher's daring night strike on June 20th. At 1900 hours, with Ozawa's retreating carriers detected 275 miles away, Mitcher ordered an unprecedented launch at dusk. Hundreds of aircraft roared off carrier decks into the fading light, striking Japanese ships at nightfall. Among the targets was the carrier Hiyo, which exploded and sank after a torpedo hit her aviation tanks, an eerie repetition of the Shōkaku's fate. When the American pilots returned, many ran out of fuel and ditched at sea in the dark. Destroyers patrolled through the night, rescuing airmen by flashlight and flare. Mitcher himself stood on deck, chain-smoking, watching each returning flash of light. At dawn, the count was made. 3 Japanese carriers sunk, Shokaku, Taiho, Hiyo. Hundreds of planes destroyed. The Imperial Navy had ceased to be a serious carrier force. On June 21st, Ozawa radioed Tokyo the grim truth. "We have lost the greater part of our air strength. The enemy is superior in every respect." He added with stoic precision, "I take full responsibility for the outcome." His words were received in silence. The message marked not just the end of a battle, but the end of an era. The Kido Butai, which had once ruled the Pacific, no longer existed. In the depths of the ocean, the Shokaku rested upright on the seafloor, 9,800 feet down. Her decks were torn, her hangars silent, but her emblem, the crane, still adorned the hull. For Japanese sailors who survived, the memory of her was a wound that never closed. In post-war reunions, they spoke of her not as a ship, but as a spirit. "She carried our youth," one former airman said, "and our faith. When she fell, so did our hope." Across the Pacific, the men of the USS Cavalla received their Navy crosses and a Presidential Unit citation. Their logbook entry for June 19th was brief and unsentimental. "Engaged enemy carrier. 4 hits. Target sunk." But to historians, and to the sea itself, the encounter marked a hinge in history. For every empire that rises upon steel and silk, there comes a moment when its pride meets its predator. For Japan, that moment had come on June 19th, 1944, when the Soaring Crane folded her wings beneath the waves and the ocean kept her secret for 80 years. June 19th, 1944, Philippine Sea, and the aftermath, 1944 to 1946. At 11:40 a.m. on June 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler peered through the periscope of the USS Cavalla SS-244. The green-grey water of the Philippine Sea shimmered under a merciless sun. At 90 feet below the surface, the silence was taut, only the hum of the electric motors and the low murmur of orders passing down the narrow steel corridors. Kostler's voice was calm, but edged with focus. "There she is. Looks like Shōkaku. Bearing 345, range 1,200 yards. Turn 4 degrees starboard." Through the scope, he saw a vision that had haunted American intelligence for years. A great Japanese carrier, sleek and armoured, with a rising sun flag snapping in the wind. Planes lined her deck. The glint of sunlight caught her island tower. She was majestic, oblivious, moving fast, about 26 knots, zigzagging slightly as her air group prepared to launch. At 11:41, Cavalla's torpedo room reported ready. 6 fish, Mark 23 steam torpedoes, waited in their tubes, charged and primed. The submarine trembled with potential energy, the crew knowing that what they were about to attempt could change the course of the battle raging above. Kostler gave the order. "Fire 1! Fire 2! Fire 3! Fire 4! Fire 5! Fire 6! The torpedoes hissed into the sea, their wakes cutting through the blue like streaks of white fire. 30 seconds later, the first explosion rolled through the water, then another, and another. On the Shōkaku's bridge, Captain Hiroshi Matsubara felt the deck lurch beneath him. A deep metallic roar shuddered through the hull, followed by the hiss of escaping steam. The carrier heeled violently to port. Inside the hangar decks, aviation fuel lines burst. Flame raced across the floor like a serpent. Within minutes, smoke poured from the ship's forward section. Bulkheads twisted and groaned. Damage control parties sprinted through the inferno, dragging hoses and extinguishers. The air was thick with gasoline vapor and burning rubber. "Seal compartments," Matsubara ordered, his voice hoarse. "Stop the fires at all costs." But the fires had already reached the bomb storage. At 12:10, 2 massive secondary explosions ripped through the forward hangar. Debris and aircraft parts were hurled skyward. The carrier shuddered, her bow sagging, her engines dying one by one. Crewmen were blown into the sea, clinging to rafts slick with oil. At 12:40, with the flames now uncontrolled and the ship listing 25 degrees, Matsubara gave the order no captain ever wished to speak. "Abandon ship." Below, in the Cavalla's control room, the sonar man reported, "Multiple explosions, breaking up noises. Target going down, sir." Kostler stood silent, hand resting on the periscope handle. The sound of the sea filled the compartment, the slow rolling rumble of a dying giant. They had done it. One submarine, 76 men, had destroyed a fleet carrier of 2,600 crew and 70 aircraft. But there was no time to celebrate. Within seconds, destroyers began dropping depth charges. The first salvo hit close, the lights flickered, water sprayed from pipe joints, metal shrieked. Cavalla dove deeper, down to 400 feet, her hull creaking as pressure mounted. The next 3 hours were a storm of steel. 106 depth charges detonated around her. Men held their breath as valves rattled and bolts popped from the strain. One charge exploded so close that the sonar dome cracked, but the boat held together. When the sounds of the hunt finally faded, Kostler surfaced cautiously at dusk. The horizon was empty, only burning oil and drifting wreckage. He raised his binoculars and whispered, "We got her." His log entry for the day was characteristically brief. Engaged enemy CV at 11:40. 6 torpedoes fired, 4 hits observed. Target sunk. The news reached Pearl Harbor 2 days later. Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Forces, sent a terse but proud message to Kosler. "Congratulations on an excellent attack. The sinking of a Shokaku-class carrier is a major victory. Well done and well earned." In Washington, the intelligence staff at OP-20G compared intercepted Japanese communications. Radio Tokyo confirmed the loss indirectly, referring to a major carrier casualty. Within a week, American analysts concluded what Cavalla's crew already knew. The Shōkaku was gone. For the men of the Cavalla, the patrol was over. They had struck one of the last great ships of Japan's carrier fleet, the same vessel that had launched planes over Pearl Harbor. The submarine limped back to Fremantle, battered but intact, where Kosler and his crew were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. One sailor later recalled the moment they learned which ship they had sunk. When the message came in, target identified as Shokaku, the whole crew just went quiet. Nobody cheered. We knew what she meant. We'd killed the ghost of Pearl Harbor. In Japan, the news was received in whispers. The Navy Ministry released no public statement. Officially, Shokaku was listed as missing in action, her name struck from the registry weeks later. Families were informed with the same curt notice used for all naval losses. "Your son has performed meritorious service for the Empire and fallen gloriously in battle." For Admiral Ozawa, commanding what was left of the mobile fleet, the loss was personal. Shōkaku had been his symbol of endurance, rebuilt after Coral Sea, blooded at Santa Cruz, and still flying when others had burned. Her destruction left him shaken. In his post-war testimony, Ozawa admitted, "When I learned of her loss, I knew the battle was already lost. Shōkaku was not only a ship, she was our heart." After the war, in 1946, Allied divers and Japanese engineers reviewed battle reports for the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Using Cavalla's patrol log, sonar data, and survivor interviews, they reconstructed the sinking. The evidence was conclusive. 4 torpedo hits on the port side, one near the forward aviation fuel tanks, another near the boiler rooms, and 2 beneath the hangars. The carrier had gone down at 12:23 p.m., about 140 miles northeast of Yap Island. Depth, nearly 9,500 feet. Only 570 men of her crew of 2,600 survived. When Japanese survivor Petty Officer Seiji Maihara was interviewed at Yokosuka, he described his last moments aboard. "We heard the torpedoes strike like hammer blows. The deck became smoke and flame. Men were running, shouting, but there was no air to breathe. I remember climbing the catwalk to the flight deck and seeing the sea turn black with oil. The ship was burning from the inside. When I jumped, I looked back. She was already sinking by the bow. The crane painted on her stack disappeared beneath the waves. The crane never dies. That's what we said. But she died that day. For decades, Shōkaku's resting place was only a position on a map. Then, in October 2019, an expedition led by the RV Petrel, funded by Paul G. Allen, found her. The remotely operated vehicle descended through miles of dark water until her ghost appeared, her flight deck torn open, her hull eerily intact. The red circle of the rising sun still visible on a shattered wing. 75 years after her death, the Soaring Crane was found, silent and whole again, watched over by the same ocean that had swallowed her. In the control room of the Petrel, the operators bowed their heads. One whispered softly, "Otsukare-sama, Shōkaku-san, you've been found at last." And in that moment, the echoes beneath the waves, of men who fought, burned, and died for nations now at peace, seemed to settle into silence. June-August 1944, USS Cavalla, Pacific War, Post-War Reflections. When the USS Cavalla, SS-244, surfaced at dawn on June 20, 1944, the Philippine Sea was eerily calm. Smoke still lingered on the horizon, faint and grey against the rising sun. The submarine had spent the entire night at silent running, dodging depth charges and sonar pings that cracked like thunder underwater. Her hull was battered, some gauges still trembling, but she was alive, and so was her crew. Inside the conning tower, Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler took a slow breath. He was 32 years old, a quiet man with a mind built for math and patience. He had once been an instructor at the submarine school in Groton, Connecticut, before the war dragged him west across the Pacific. That morning, staring through the periscope, he allowed himself a rare smile. The Shokaku, the ship whose planes had strafed Pearl Harbor, bombed the Coral Sea, and duelled at Santa Cruz, was gone. One submarine had accomplished what squadrons of bombers and cruisers had failed to do for 3 years. Chief Torpedoman John McCarthy, exhausted but grinning, clapped his commanding officer on the shoulder. "We sent her to the bottom, skipper." "Pearl's got company now." Kostler didn't answer immediately. He kept his eye pressed to the scope, watching the slick of burning oil drift on the sea. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but low. "Mark it on the chart." Time, 12:23 hours yesterday. Position, 14 degrees north, 137 east. The Shokaku has been sunk. In the narrow mess compartment, the men celebrated with canned peaches and black coffee. A few passed around cigarettes, the smoke curling against the red glow of the battle lights. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly, a blue desert of triumph and tension. Radio man Bill Evers tuned the set to high frequency, sending the encoded message back to Pearl Harbor. Enemy carrier sunk by 6 torpedoes, 4 hits observed, Cavalla withdrawing westward. The crew cheered when he finished tapping the final code group, but the joy was tempered. They had survived, yes, but barely. The previous day's depth charge barrage had nearly crushed the hull. 2 men had been thrown against bulkheads. One suffered a concussion. The smell of burned insulation lingered in the air. Kostler gathered his officers in the control room. "We'll stay submerged during daylight," he said. "Surface only to charge batteries at night. Enemy destroyers may still be in the area." There were no grand speeches. Submarine men knew better. Pride was measured in silence, in the hum of engines, in the sound of the sea scraping against the hull. 2 weeks later, July 2nd, 1944, the Cavalla limped into Fremantle, Australia, her paint scorched and her hull plates dented inward. Dockyard workers swarmed her decks, pointing at the scars that told the story better than words. The crew disembarked to the blare of a Navy band and the cheers of other submariners. Their patrol had lasted only 47 days, but it was among the most significant in Pacific submarine history. At the briefing room, Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, was waiting with his characteristic cigar and gravel voice. He rose as Kostler entered. "Well done, Cavalla. You sank one of the bastards that started this war." Kostler saluted sharply. "Thank you, Admiral." Lockwood handed him a telegram from Washington. Cavalla credited with destruction of Japanese fleet carrier Shōkaku. Presidential unit citation approved. Entire crew commended. For a long moment, Kostler read it silently, his expression unreadable. Then he folded the message, placed it in his breast pocket, and said simply, "Permission to rejoin the patrol roster after refit, sir?" Lockwood grinned. "You'll get your chance." War's not over yet. Back in Tokyo, the mood was grim. Intelligence officers scoured radio intercepts, trying to confirm what the Imperial Navy already feared. The loss of Shokaku was initially suppressed, reported only as unconfirmed. But when the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended days later with the destruction of Taiho and Hiyo, silence could no longer hide the truth. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the Naval General Staff's Operations Division, wrote in his diary, "The Kido Butai is gone. Our carriers are now mere names. The cranes have fallen. The psychological blow was immense. For years, the Shokaku class had symbolized the modern might of Japan's fleet. Her loss was more than material. It was spiritual, proof that the gods of Tsushima no longer watched over the rising sun. The USS Cavalla, meanwhile, continued her war. In later patrols, she would sink the transport Nishu Maru and survive another brutal counterattack near Luzon. Her crew grew close as brothers, superstitious, fatalistic, and loyal to their quiet skipper. They would later describe Kosler as a man who carried his ghosts well. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the Cavalla was in Guam, being prepared for another patrol. The men learned of Hiroshima and Nagasaki from a static-filled radio broadcast. No one spoke for a long time. Then someone muttered, "Maybe now we can go home." Kosler didn't smile. "Let's just get there," he said. Post-war, the Cavalla became a symbol of submarine valor. Her attack was dissected in training manuals, taught at Annapolis, and cited in tactical lectures for decades. But for Kosler, the war's glory was something distant and uncomfortable. In a 1962 interview during the US-Japanese Naval History Symposium, he was asked if he felt pride in sinking Shokaku. He hesitated, then said, "Pride isn't the word. Respect, maybe. She was a fine ship, fought hard in every campaign. We were enemies, but we understood each other. I only wish more of her crew had lived to see peace." Across the Pacific, surviving Japanese officers spoke with similar respect. Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, who had once commanded air groups aboard Shokaku, called her loss a warrior's death. Others, interviewed by Allied historians, remembered her as the last true carrier of the old Navy. In 1985, at the Pacific Veterans Reunion in Honolulu, a small group of men, Americans and Japanese, met for the first time. Among them was Cavalla's former torpedo officer, Lieutenant Ralph Henry, and Petty Officer Seiji Mehara, one of the 570 survivors of Shokaku. They stood together in front of a memorial wreath cast into the sea. Henry offered a handshake. Mehara bowed. Neither spoke for a while. Then Mehara said softly, "She was called the Crane because we believed she would never die. But the sea keeps all things. You gave us peace by ending her suffering." Henry nodded, eyes wet. "We never forgot her," he said. "Or you." By the time the wreck of Shokaku was discovered in 2019, nearly all who had served aboard her or hunted her were gone. Yet the story remained, carved into the archives, whispered in memorials, and preserved in the steel bones resting beneath 9,800 feet of Pacific silence. For the historians who reviewed those patrol logs and Japanese diaries, the lesson was not about victory or defeat, but symmetry, the kind that war, in its rarest moments, creates between enemies who never meet but share the same sea. Beneath the waves, the Soaring Crane still sleeps, her decks unbroken by time. And somewhere above, in faded photographs and forgotten medals, the faces of the men who sent her there remain young forever, framed in the dim red light of a submarine, listening for the echo of their own courage in the sound of the deep. The torpedo from USS Cavalla had struck deep, just below the island, starboard side. For one heartbeat there was only disbelief. Then the Shokaku shuddered from bow to stern, her hull ringing like struck iron. A column of flame shot up through the hangar deck, carrying with it fragments of planes, men, and fuel. Captain Matsubara steadied himself on the bridge railing, staring into a storm of smoke and fire. "Damage control starboard," he shouted, but the words were swallowed by the roar of burning avgas. Inside the hangar, aviation fuel lines had ruptured. The fire raced down the catwalks like a living thing, devouring Zeros fully armed and fueled for launch. Within seconds, the hangar became a furnace. Below decks, damage control teams fought with hoses and sand, choking on fumes. The pumps were working, but the list increased. 5 degrees, then 8. Shōkaku was dying fast. At 11:20 hours, a second explosion tore through the forward magazines. The deck plates buckled, A geyser of flame ripped through the flight deck. Planes chained to the catapults were hurled into the sea like toys. The signal bridge caught fire. From the periscope of USS Cavalla, Commander Hermann Kossler saw it all: the towering black column, the rolling fire. He could almost feel the shockwave. "Direct hit," his exec whispered. Kossler said nothing, just watched as the once proud carrier began to slow, her wake thinning. Then, at 11:35, another explosion, the largest yet, erupted amidships. Inside the burning hulk, hundreds of men were trapped. The bow dipped sharply, flames licked the island's crane mast. Matsubara gave the order: "Abandon ship." Lifeboats were useless. The sea was aflame with oil. Men leapt overboard, some on fire, some clinging to wreckage. The escort destroyers Urakaze and Hatsuzuki rushed to pick up survivors, dodging debris and bodies. By 11:40, the ship that had struck Pearl Harbor and fought at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz was listing 25 degrees. The forward flight deck was underwater. The Shōkaku heaved once, rolled to port, and slipped beneath the waves. The ocean swallowed her stern with a hiss of steam and smoke, gone in under an hour. Kossler's crew listened as sonar reported the metallic groan of implosion far below. The captain exhaled. Down scope. Cavalla turned silently away, diving deep to evade the destroyers above. Back in Japan, the news spread through the Imperial Navy like a wound reopening. To many, it seemed impossible: the Soaring Crane, brought down by a single submarine. Admiral Ozawa, upon hearing the report, said quietly, "Even the Crane cannot fly forever." The Shokaku's loss marked more than the end of a ship. It was the fading of an era. Her wreck would rest 240 kilometers northeast of the Philippines, 1,200 feet below the surface, a tomb of steel and honor. The Phoenix had burned for the last time. The sea closed over the Shokaku quietly, as though the Pacific itself were sealing away the last breath of Japan's naval pride. When the bubbles faded, only oil slicks and wreckage remained, twisted deck plating, shredded silk flags, and the occasional lifeless form drifting among them. The destroyer Urakaze circled the site for hours, plucking half-burned men from the sea. Of the crew of 1,660, fewer than 570 would ever see land again. Aboard USS Cavalla, Commander Hermann Kossler ordered the submarine to run silent and deep. Above, Japanese depth charges thundered, exploding in dark sequences, but the Cavalla endured. In the control room, sweat streamed down faces. Kossler's voice was calm. "Hold steady, gentlemen. The ocean's on our side." After 7 tense hours, the destroyers gave up the hunt. When the submarine finally surfaced under cover of night, the crew gathered topside, staring into the moonlit waters. None spoke. They all knew what they had done. Days later, Cavalla's coded message reached Pearl Harbor. One line was all it said: "Shokaku sunk. Probable total loss." In Admiral Chester Nimitz's office, silence hung for a long moment. He removed his glasses and said softly, "Poetic justice." Across the Pacific, the reaction was starkly different. At Kure Naval Base, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa received the telegram in the pre-dawn stillness. His aide hesitated before reading it aloud. Ozawa closed his eyes. The Shokaku had been more than steel to him. She was the last symbol of Yamamoto's dream, a fleet of airborne supremacy, swift and untouchable. Now, that dream lay at the bottom of the sea. "Tell the men," he said, "that the Crane flies no more." In post-war years, the loss of Shokaku became a haunting echo in Japanese naval circles. Surviving crewmen spoke of the fire that moved like wind and the eerie calm before the ship rolled. Many could still recall the scent of burning fuel mingled with sea salt, a smell that never left their memories. For the Americans, Cavalla's victory became legend. Her captain received the Navy Cross, the crew the Presidential Unit Citation. Yet Kosler himself remained humble to his death. In an interview decades later, he said, "It wasn't vengeance, it was duty. She was a fine ship, and she fought to the end." In 2019, 75 years later, a deep-sea exploration team discovered the Shōkaku's wreck, upright on the seabed. Her rising sun emblem was still visible on the bow, her flight deck eerily intact. It was as though the great carrier had merely gone to sleep beneath the waves, the soaring crane at rest. Steel, silk, and memory, all that remained of an empire's pride. The ocean had kept its secret, but the echoes of that day in June 1944 still whispered through the depths. Even the crane once soaring must one day fall.